As the final creation for this tutorial series, we're going to be making a dagger that looks pretty close to this. We're going to be applying all the knowledge we've learned so far, as well as learning some new stuff. We'll certainly be learning new modeling tools and strategies, but most importantly, by the time we finish this dagger, you'll have learned the basics of UV unwrapping and texturing, which seems to be the biggest hump for new artists to get over. Things here might seem a little abstract and difficult to grasp at first, but when you come out of the other side of this, sky's the limit as to what you can make. So let's jump right into modeling here. So the first thing I want to do is get this image into 3ds Max as a background image so that we can easily model from it without having to eyeball stuff and constantly switch back and forth between these two applications. So we can go to views and go into viewport background and go into viewport background and then browse to it, or we can do it the cool way, which is just to simply drag and drop it into the view that we want it, and then this little dialog pops up. I don't want it as an environment map, I just want it as a viewport background, and then click OK. We have a little problem though. Actually, we have three problems. The first problem is that if we had something in our scene, the image is not staying in the same place, so our entire scene is kind of sliding around on top of it. The next problem is that since the default wireframe in Max is white, we can't see our mesh. And then the other problem is that just how this image is, the sword is going diagonally, which we could model from, but that'll be kind of annoying because then we're constantly going to be having to work on the local axis, and it'll just be a whole lot easier if we align this sword with the tangent of the x-axis. So the first thing we should do is go back into our viewport background dialog, and if we say match bitmap and be sure that lock zoom pan is enabled, then our sword is actually going to stay in the same place, and it's also not going to be all distorted to fit to the viewport boundaries, which is good. Our next two problems we can fix simply by making some changes to the actual photo here. Dupe this layer, put a blank layer on top of that, and just draw a straight line, and then I'm just going to rotate this until it becomes straight, and maybe we can get them both kind of orientated right and left just so they kind of fit on the same page. And I don't want these extra parts polluting my pristine image, so I'm just going to fill them with white. Then I shall merge them all down. And finally knock out some of this contrast, particularly the whole upper end of this image here, because we don't want that white conflicting with the white wireframe. And take out a little of the darks too. And I'll just save that image over the old one. And then to update our background, oddly enough, we can just kind of jiggle this window around a little, and our image updates. Now we're ready to begin modeling for realsies. Clear my scene, and if this grid is annoying you, if you don't need it or want it, you can just press G. Same goes for any viewport, even perspective. I'm going to start with the blade, and I'm just going to try to follow this shape. Now I don't want a bunch of subdivisions. If I need subdivisions, I'll make them. So I'm just going to put 1 by 1 and then convert this plane to an editable poly. I'm just going to go into vert mode and just align these verts with the contour of my sword. Now we're going to learn something new that I use a lot, and it'll probably be easiest to see in perspective. If we go into edge mode and grab an edge and we shift drag it just like we can do to objects to duplicate them, it'll kind of extend an edge out of the other edge, which is really cool. It's a very good way to make shapes, and I really like it a lot. So we can easily use that moving forward with this blade to make the shape, as opposed to up front trying to guess how many subdivisions we're going to eventually need to get the shape of this blade right. We can very easily just use the move mode and shift drag a new edge, and then immediately just switch to scale and line it all up. So you can see that's a pretty effective way of doing it. Now instead of collapsing these verts into one vert to make for a very pointy sword end, it might be best just to make them very small, because if you look really closely at the very point of a sword, it probably isn't perfectly sharp. It probably has a tiny bit of bluntness to it, and down the road this will work out better for the smoothing groups. Now I'm just in vertex mode, refining the shape a bit. Now our sword is not perfectly symmetrical. I mean, one side is slightly different than the other side, but that's okay because this dagger looks to be crudely built in real life. It's not like they used laser precision to create it, so why would we want to use laser precision to create it in 3D? This little discrepancy in the two sides might just add a little bit of character and give it a little bit more realism. Computers and 3D programs constantly want to make things perfect, and things in the real world are not perfect, so it's important to leave as much imperfection as you can. So if we go into perspective, our blade is of course not a blade at all, it's a completely flat piece of paper. So to give our blade a little bit of beef, we can go into edge mode and press Alt-R to get a ring selection of these edges, and then use the connect tool to give us a segment. And then we can simply move these verts out, and I simply used my control click to make this selection. Just drag these guys out a little bit, and from the top view I can make sure that our blade has a nice contour. Now this is only one side of our sword. We're going to want whatever we do on this side to also be on the other side. So there are two basic ways we can accomplish this. We can accomplish this with a mirrored instance using this mirror tool, or we can use the Symmetry Modifier. Now in this particular situation, the Symmetry Modifier is probably going to work better for us, but I want to use this opportunity to show you guys instancing in context. So an instance, so if we shift drag a duplicate of our object, when this little dialog pops up, you'll notice we have a few options here, and by default it's set to copy. Now a copy is simply going to make a copy of our mesh, and of course if we modify it, everything is good and dandy, it's a separate copy. However, if we create an instance, then when we modify this mesh, you'll notice that the other mesh is modifying with it. That's because this mesh is an instance of the other mesh, which basically means that they're referencing each other. So if we wanted to make a mirrored instance, we would click on this mirror tool, and by default it's just going to actually mirror our current object. We want to make an instance of it, and now you see it's going to actually create a duplicate of the object. So it's mirroring in the wrong direction. We need it to mirror in Y. And then if we press OK, you see that we have two sides to our sword, and if we model on one side of the sword, it will also model on the other side of the sword, which is really cool. Now this doesn't necessarily have to be in a mirroring context. It could be in anything. Let's suppose we had a whole row of statues here, perhaps along a path. We could simply set up an instance, and then we would model on one and all of the rest would update. So instancing is very powerful. Now we can simply continue modifying on this side. So now I'm going to try to make this little divot you see here on the blade. And to do that, we're going to learn a new tool. It's an excellent tool, and that is the Cut tool. This tool is going to be easiest to demonstrate for you guys in the perspective mode. Here it is, Cut. And this tool will actually work in any mode, vertex, edge, polygon, whatever. And when we enable it, you'll notice that our cursor changes to these little cut icons here. Now the hotkey for cut is Alt-C. I use this tool a lot, so that's the way I usually get to it. And the idea of the tool is that we can simply click and make crazy cuts on the surface of our mesh, which is very cool. And I want to explain the pre-visualization cursor a little bit. So if our cursor is looking like this, that means we're just amidst a face, and it'll change to a line if the cut tool is detected that we're clicking on a line, and then it'll change to like a little crosshair if we're going to click on a vert. So it kind of by default snaps to those things for us, which is nice. Now something I do want to note about the cut tool is that it is a very good cut tool, and it's better than most 3D programs' cut tool, but it does have limits. Like you wouldn't want to make a cut like this, for instance. I mean, not that you'd ever want to make a cut like that in the first place, but as a technical thing, this is going to make really crappy geometry. We're going to have all sorts of crazy end gowns, and Max is just going to divide them up as it pleases, and it might not always necessarily be a good way. You'll see if I select this polygon here and move it out, it's just really messed up. So when you do make cuts, you're going to want to control your cuts a bit and be mindful of what's happening. And the way you can do that is just to give it a break every once in a while. So when you make a couple cuts, just find an ending point, then right click to get out of your current cut and start a new cut. And that will yield better results. Then when you're all done, you can right click again and you'll be completely out of cut mode, or press Q. One final note about the cut tool. If you go for a cut, but you're noticing your little cursor icons are not showing up and you can't seem to cut at all, be sure that you're not trying to cut through the back side of a face. So you'll notice if I look at the front side of this face, I can see my cuts go fine. But if I try to cut from the back side, it's not going to work. Just keep that in mind. So now I'm going to make the cut for this groove. Keeping in mind what I said about how messed up the cut tool can get, I'm just going to do it in small bite-sized cuts. Okay, just going to grab all these verts now and move them in. Using Alt to deselect that one vert, and I can see that my smoothing groups are a little bit messed up. Also, my faces were backwards for some reason, so I'm going to go ahead and flip them. You can see that when your faces are backwards, because the red that it shows up is like darker, and when you're looking at the front side, the red when you have faces selected is brighter. So I'm just going to run a auto smooth, see what happens. Looks like that did the job for us. I'm going to add a few more cuts to refine the shape here. I think the sword end is a little bit too low poly. So I'm just going to add 2 new cuts with my cut tool. I have decided that the blade groove is a touch too deep for my liking, so I'm just going to make it a little more shallow. Keeping in mind that the Z key will center my camera. Another basic tool that we can use here is called Chamfer. And we basically make an edge selection and we just click and drag on it, and it will kind of split that edge into 2 edges. And that'll round out our groove for us a bit. I think we can call the blade done now. But let's suppose that we didn't want to leave this blade as 2 different sides. Perhaps we want it to be one solid object. Well, to do that, we can use the Attach tool, which can be accessed at object level or sub-object level when you have an object selected. But you can't attach an instance to its own instance. That'll mess things up. So what we can do to break the instance is we can select both of them and just right click on them and say convert to editable poly, and that'll convert them both to editable polys, and it'll also break the instance. So now if we click on attach and then click on the other one, it'll attach them. Now it's important to note that attach is not something that you can use like you have multiple objects, you select them, and then you want to attach them. Oh, how do I attach them? Look, there's nothing is showing up over here. That's because you have to attach one object to another. You can't select a bunch of objects at once and attach them all with the attach tool. So to attach, you select the first object, then you click attach, and then you select your second object and third object and fourth object, however many additional objects you want to attach. You can also use the list here to show you a list of all the objects in your scene, and you can select them that way as well. And while I'm showing you guys attach, I should show you guys detach. So when you are in sub-object mode and you have a selection, and you want to make this selection into a separate object, you don't want it to be housed in this object anymore, then you could scroll down here and press detach, and it'll show you this dialog. It'll ask you if you want to detach it to a different element, which will basically just partition it from the rest of the mesh, but leave it in the same object. I'll show you guys that. So now that I've detached it into an element, I can move it out here, but it's all still the same object. You'll notice if I hop back up to Editable Poly, it's all still the same object. If I wanted to detach it into a completely different object, then when this dialog popped up, we would make sure just not to have that checked. We would give the object a new name, and now you'll see we have two separate objects here. So that's how attaching and detaching works. Now, we have attached them. They are one object, it's true, but they're still different elements. Now, I haven't explained what elements are to you guys yet. It's just another sub-object mode, as you can see. And what it does is it selects entire contiguous meshes. So this is all one object, but we have two separate meshes here. If I drag this out, you'll see these verts aren't attached. So in element mode, we can easily select entire shells, so to speak. So to attach this all and make this all one contiguous mesh or one element, we're going to need to weld these verts here. We could select verts 2 by 2 and start collapsing them, but there's an easier way to do it. But first, you'll notice that my faces are backward, indicated by the dark red. And so I'm going to Control A and flip them. I'm not quite sure how the faces keep getting turned around, but now everything should be good and dandy. So if we go into vertex mode and press Control A to select all, we can use this Weld tool. And Weld is basically going to merge together verts that are within a certain distance from each other, and that distance is defined in the threshold here. So if I increase this distance a whole ton, you'll see all kinds of stuff starts snapping together because we have verts that are less than this distance from each other. So if we have a very low threshold, then only verts that are very close to each other, such as these verts here, will actually weld together. So if I just hit the check and then I go into element mode and select this, you'll see it all selects at once. And if I drag this polygon out, you'll see that these verts are indeed welded together as they should be. I'm going to move on to the guard now. Now this looks like a pretty complicated shape, but it's really not that bad. And you guys will see how we make it here. It essentially has two contours from two different angles. If we look at it head on, we have this shape here. And if we look at it from the bottom or top of it, then we'd have this shape here. If we can just make both those contours by making some cuts and pushing verts, then we should have a shape that looks awfully close to this. So I'll show you guys what I mean here. Now I'm going to start with the plane exactly like I did on the blade. I think I'm going to only make half of it and then mirror the other half, because this shape is a little more involved and I don't really want to do it twice. So I'm going to give it one segment in each direction. Then we're just going to convert it to an editable poly. So I don't know if you guys have noticed, but I keep on dragging and getting this circle marquee. And maybe you guys are having that problem too. And the reason why that is because Q, while it gets you to your default selector tool, also changes your selection region type. So if we press Q, it'll start to toggle through these different types of selection regions. And I'll show you what these selection regions are. This default one is the square, the marquee. And that one's really nice, you know, because it's like normal and humane. However, we have all these other ones too. We have this circular one, which never used in my life. Maybe you could use it in very specific situations when you're trying to select like a, I don't know, a group of polygons on a sphere. But I think there are easier ways to do that still. Then we have this, I guess it's called the fence selection. And for that one, we click and drag and it'll create a line. Then when we let go, it'll start to make another line, and then we start clicking sequentially to create a really crazy selection. And we go all the way back to the beginning here, and our cursor will turn to this little plus, and then it'll, whatever we encompass, it will select. Then we also have this one, which is just loop-de-loo, draw, lasso, fun time. And we have the paint selection, which is actually a kind of cool one. So to give you an example of that, I'll jump over to my blade and just go into face mode. And we can just paint a selection. So we just drag our mouse over stuff, and whenever we drag over, it selects, which is pretty neat. However, that being said, I rarely ever use it. So let's get back to modeling this guy. Just going to move these verts into place. Now I'm going to start making some connections. So I'm going to use the hotkey Control-Shift-E to make a connection and just start to follow the contour of this. It's not going to take much. We can start out low poly to get the big forms and then continue to add cuts and refine the shape. Okay, so that's pretty much the contour of the one angle. Now let's do the other angle. I'll just go into the left view here and just look at the back of this. I don't need to follow it exactly, I can just kind of eyeball it. I'm just trying to eyeball the shape here and essentially draw it by moving the verts. And I'm going to need one additional subdivision to carry this contour here. Now I'll take this opportunity to show you guys the Symmetry Modifier, the other way of mirroring. So I'm just going to type S and click on Symmetry here. And it's going to start us off on the wrong axis here. So we can change the axis. That's going to be our right one, but it's not mirroring at the correct location. We want this little mirror plane to be actually right here. So we can move that simply by diving into the subobject mode of our Symmetry Modifier and clicking on the mirror, and we can move it about just like we can move any other object. And here's something cool. We can put another Symmetry Modifier right on top of this one and mirror it in the other direction. And the nice part about symmetry is we won't ever have to do any attaching and welding, because it'll do all that for us if we have slice along mirror and weld seam checked. So the next step I'm going to do is convert all of this to an editable poly. So it's all just one big mesh. And now I'd like to obviously create polygons to come across here. So I'm going to use a new tool called the Bridge tool. And I'll also take this opportunity to show you guys the final type of subobject, which is border. And border is just going to select the border of a mesh. Simple as that. So once we have both borders selected, we can use this Bridge tool. And Bridge is going to draw a bridge of polygons between our selection. So if I were to delete a polygon, for instance, out of our mesh and select these two edges, we could use Bridge to fill that gap. There's another way we could fill this gap, kind of a more manual method, and that would be to use our Shift drag to drag out a polygon, then go into vertex mode and use my very favorite tool in the whole world, which is Target Weld, in which you click on the first vert, then click on the second vert, and it will weld the first vert to the second vert. Very powerful tool. I use it a lot. The only reason why I showed you guys how to patch that hole like that is because I wanted to show you Target Weld, and I couldn't think of any other situation to use it on this particular dagger. So you can see the shape really wasn't as difficult as you may have thought it was going to be to create. Something strange about this object though. Due to the fact that we started on this side, the pivot point for this object is kind of in a weird spot. It's not in the middle of our object because it started over here, and the pivot doesn't move unless we tell it to. So to actually move our pivot, we need to go into this new tab that we've never used before called Hierarchy, which shows a little picture of a hierarchy. And then we can click Affect Pivot Only. Now any transformations we do will affect the pivot only. We can use this little button, Center to Object, to allow Max to kind of automatically find the center point of the object. Then we can decheck Affect Pivot Only, and then our pivot will be golden. This guard's edges look a little bit sharp, and the thing overall looks a little bit blocky. So to finish this guard off, we're going to revisit our good friend Chamfer. I'm going to use Alt-L here to select a loop, and Alt-L again. You could also select both sides like this and press Alt-L and it'll loop both of them. And then just click and drag, and now we'll get a little bit of a Weld Chamfer on the edge here, which will be good for throwing highlights and such. So our guard and our blade are complete, and in the next chapter we will be finishing up this dagger model with the grip and the pommel.